My name is Marjorie Jackson, and I'm 41 years old. If you had asked me a year ago whether money could quietly dismantle a marriage, I would have said no. Not loudly, not dramatically, but slowly, like water seeping into cracks you didn't know were there. I've learned it absolutely can. Our house used to feel stable, not perfect, but stable. A blended family, a routine that mostly worked, and two teenage boys trying to figure out what adulthood was supposed to look like. My biological son, Caleb, was 17 then. Thoughtful, careful, the kind of kid who read reviews before buying anything and still hesitated at checkout. My stepson, Ryan, was 19, confident to the point of recklessness. He believed money was meant to be enjoyed, not hoarded, and that things somehow always worked out. They both lived with us. They both had part-time retail jobs at the mall. Same kinds of shifts, same minimum wage. Ryan had started working first, mostly because he was older and more impatient about wanting spending money. When Caleb finally got hired, I made a decision I didn't announce, didn't celebrate, and definitely didn't explain in detail. I kept 30% of his paycheck. I told him it was non-negotiable, that it was about responsibility, that adulthood came with structure whether you liked it or not. He wasn't thrilled, but he didn't fight me. He trusted me. What I didn't tell him, what I quietly protected like a secret I believed would one day become a gift, was that I wasn't just holding on to his money. I was saving it. Every paycheck, I transferred that 30% into a separate account. Some weeks, when I could afford it, I added a little extra of my own. I didn't do this because Caleb asked. I did it because I remembered being his age and thinking freedom meant spending every dollar the second it hit my hands. I wanted him to start adulthood with something solid beneath his feet. My husband, Thomas, knew I was taking the money. We'd talked about it early on. We kept our finances mostly separate, his decision rooted in a messy financial past he rarely talked about. I respected that boundary. He knew what I was doing for Caleb and never objected. At least not then. Caleb knew I was taking money, but he didn't know how much or why exactly. I kept the details vague on purpose. Part of me wanted it to be a surprise. Part of me didn't want to over-explain something that felt instinctively right. Months passed. Paychecks came and went. The account quietly grew. Then Caleb started talking about cars. Nothing flashy. Used. Reliable. Something that would get him to school and work without breaking down on the highway. He talked numbers, insurance, gas costs. He was thinking ahead in a way that made my chest ache with pride. One night, we sat at the kitchen table with notebooks spread out between us. He told me how much he thought he had saved. I let him talk, let him calculate, let him sigh when he realized it wouldn't stretch as far as he'd hoped. That's when I told him. I explained the savings account. Every paycheck, every transfer, every dollar he didn't even know existed. For a moment, he just stared at me. His mouth opened slightly, then closed again. I worried, actually worried, that he might be angry, that he'd feel tricked. Instead, he stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor and wrapped his arms around me. "Mom," he laughed, voice breaking just a little. That's insane." He hugged me so tightly I almost lost my balance. I laughed and told him I hoped he'd forgive me for being controlling. He told me if I hadn't done it, he'd probably have blown the money on electronics and junk food and regretted it later. That moment, his trust, his gratitude, felt like confirmation that I'd done the right thing. I wish it had ended there. Ryan heard about the car fund 2 days later. I didn't realize he was standing in the hallway when Caleb excitedly mentioned it. I only noticed when Ryan laughed. Not amused, not happy, but sharp. "So that's why he always acts broke," he said. "Because you're hiding his money." The tone made my stomach tighten. Thomas came into the room, his expression unreadable. He didn't yell. He didn't accuse me outright. But later that night, after the boys had gone to their rooms, he sat across from me on the couch with his arms crossed. "You didn't think that might look like favoritism?" he asked. I reminded him, calmly, that I'd never stopped him from doing something similar for Ryan, that he knew exactly what I was doing, that the boys were different ages and in different places. He didn't argue those points directly. Instead, he shifted the conversation. He talked about fairness, about balance, about how Ryan might feel. That was the first time I felt something cold slide between us. The next few days were tense. Ryan became quieter, more distant. Thomas started watching my conversations with Caleb like he was looking for evidence of wrongdoing. I tried to reassure myself that this was temporary, that blended families went through growing pains, that once emotions cooled, reason would return. But late one night, lying awake beside a man who suddenly felt very far away, I realized something unsettling. This wasn't about money. It was about entitlement, about expectations that had never been spoken aloud, suddenly becoming demands, and about how quickly love gets questioned when someone thinks they're being denied something they believe they deserve. I stared at the ceiling long after Thomas fell asleep, wondering how a choice I made to protect my son's future had started unraveling the present. And deep down, I knew. We hadn't even reached the worst of it yet. If part one was about quiet choices, part two was about noise. The kind that rattles your nerves. The kind that turns dinner conversations into battlegrounds and makes you replay arguments in your head long after everyone's gone to bed. It started small, almost reasonable if you didn't look too closely. Thomas waited 3 days after Ryan found out about Caleb's savings before bringing it up again. We were washing dishes side by side, the TV murmuring in the background, when he said it, casual, almost offhand. Maybe we should think about helping Ryan out too, he said, just to keep things balanced. I dried my hands slowly. Balanced how? He shrugged. You know, maybe splitting that car fund, or at least part of it. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. Splitting? Caleb's money? Well, Thomas corrected, money you saved while he was living here, under our roof. That was the first time I felt anger bloom instead of confusion. I reminded him, again, that the money came from Caleb's own paychecks, that I'd taken a portion with his knowledge, that Ryan had never been required to save anything, that Thomas had known about all of this from the start. Thomas sighed, the way people do when they think you're being deliberately difficult. You're missing the point, he said. It's not about the technicalities. It's about how this looks. Ryan feels like you care more about Caleb. That word, care, hit harder than I expected. I care about both boys, I said carefully, but caring doesn't mean pretending they're the same person with the same needs. He didn't like that answer. Over the next week, the conversation kept resurfacing, sometimes gently, sometimes not. At dinner, Ryan started making comments, half jokes, half accusations. Must be nice having a secret bank account, he said once, pushing peas around his plate. Caleb froze, fork halfway to his mouth. Thomas didn't shut it down. Instead, he glanced at me like this was my mess to clean up. Friends started chiming in next. It amazed me how quickly private issues became public property. A couple we'd known for years joked that splitting the money would keep the peace. Thomas's sister messaged me about how blended families needed extra sensitivity. Even my own mother asked, gently, whether I'd thought about how Ryan might feel watching his brother get ahead. I felt like I was losing my footing in a room where the rules kept changing. The argument took a darker turn when Thomas brought up college. Caleb's grandparents, my parents, had already promised to help with tuition. It was something they'd planned long before I married Thomas, long before Ryan was even part of the picture. Ryan doesn't have that, Thomas said one night, voice tight. So when you give Caleb a car fund on top of that, can't you see how unfair that is? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My parents helping their grandson doesn't obligate me to compensate your son, I said. Those are two separate things. But you're his stepmother, Thomas shot back. You're supposed to want him to succeed too. That sentence lodged itself in my chest. I did want Ryan to succeed, but wanting someone to succeed didn't mean rewriting reality or confiscating what someone else had earned. Caleb heard more than I wanted him to. One evening, he came into the kitchen while I was staring at my phone, rereading yet another message about fairness. Mom, he said quietly, are they trying to take the money? I hated the way his shoulders tensed when he asked. No, I said immediately. No one's touching it. He nodded, but the relief didn't quite reach his eyes. I don't want to cause problems, he added. If it's making things worse. I cut him off. You're not the problem. That was the moment I realized how dangerous this situation had become, when a 17-year-old boy felt responsible for the emotional stability of the adults around him. Thomas's frustration escalated quickly after that. One night, after Ryan slammed his bedroom door over something trivial, Thomas rounded on me in the living room. You're tearing this family apart, he said. I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because the accusation was so absurd it felt surreal. I'm tearing the family apart, I repeated. By not stealing from my own son? By refusing to compromise, he said. By acting like Ryan doesn't matter. That was the first time he packed a bag. He didn't say it was permanent, just that he needed space. He went to stay with his sister, leaving behind a house that felt suddenly hollow. The silence that followed was worse than the arguing. Ryan barely spoke to me before he left with Thomas. Caleb tiptoed around the house, trying not to ask questions. Friends kept texting, offering advice I hadn't asked for. I lay awake at night, replaying everything, wondering how protecting one child had turned into an accusation of neglecting another, wondering when fair stopped meaning reasonable and started meaning take from one to satisfy another. A week after Thomas left, he called me. His tone was colder, more deliberate. "I've been thinking," he said. "If we're going to fix this, you need to make a gesture." "A gesture?" I asked. "For Ryan," he said. "Something concrete, something that shows you're serious about treating them equally." My stomach dropped. I knew, before he even finished speaking, that whatever he was about to ask would change everything. And I was right. I didn't sleep the night Thomas called. Not because he'd raised his voice, he hadn't. Not because he'd threatened me outright. He hadn't done that either. It was the calmness in his tone that unsettled me. The way his words sounded practiced, like he'd already decided how this conversation was supposed to end. The next morning, he called again. "I've thought it through," he said. "If you really want us to move forward, you need to buy Ryan a car. The same kind Caleb's getting. Same price, same everything." For a moment, I was genuinely speechless. "You want me to buy your son a car?" I said slowly, "with money saved from my son's paychecks." "Yes," Thomas replied, as if the logic were flawless. "That's the only way this stops feeling unequal." Something inside me snapped, not explosively, but cleanly, like a rope finally giving way after being pulled too tight for too long. "That's not equality," I said. "That's punishment." He didn't like that. "You're choosing sides," he said sharply. "You always have." I reminded him, again, that Ryan was 19, that he'd had more time, more freedom, and no restrictions on how he spent his money, that Caleb had sacrificed part of every paycheck without complaint. Thomas dismissed it all with a single sentence. "He feels like he doesn't belong." That word again, belong. As if belonging could be purchased. As if forcing sameness could replace fairness. I told him no. Firmly, clearly, without apology. That's when the demands escalated. 3 days later, Thomas called me in the middle of the afternoon. I could hear his sister's TV in the background. He sounded irritated, like I was the one being unreasonable for not anticipating his next move. "If you can't afford the car," he said, "then maybe you should ask your parents to help Ryan with college." I actually laughed, out loud, before I could stop myself. "You want me to ask my parents," I said, "to pay for your son's college tuition?" "Yes," he replied. "They're already helping Caleb. It's only fair." Only fair. That phrase had lost all meaning. "They're his grandparents," I said. "Ryan barely knows them." "That's not the point," Thomas shot back. "If you cared about Ryan the same way, you'd at least try." I ended the call before he could say anything else. I sat there afterward, phone still in my hand, staring at the wall. It felt like I was watching my marriage from a distance, finally seeing it clearly for the first time. This wasn't about Ryan's feelings anymore. It was about control, about rewriting reality until Thomas got the outcome he wanted, about using guilt, pressure, and emotional blackmail to force compliance. That night, I talked to a lawyer. Just a consultation, I told myself. Just information. But the moment the word divorce was spoken out loud, something in my chest loosened instead of tightening. A week later, I had papers drawn up. Sending them felt surreal. My hand shook as I pressed send, a wave of relief and grief crashing into each other all at once. Thomas's reaction was immediate. "What the hell is this?" he yelled over the phone. "You're seriously doing this?" "Yes," I said quietly. "I am." "You're blowing up our marriage over money," he snapped. "No," I replied. "I'm ending it because you're willing to hurt my son to prove a point." That's when the insults started. He called me selfish, accused me of being a terrible stepmother, said I'd never really accepted Ryan as family. Each word landed hard, but instead of breaking me, they confirmed something I'd been avoiding. No explanation would ever be enough for him. I hung up. The house felt strangely peaceful afterward. Empty, yes, but calm. Like the silence after a storm when the air finally clears. Caleb noticed immediately. We sat on the couch that evening, the TV on mute, neither of us really watching it. "Are you and Thomas?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "We're getting divorced." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm sorry," he said finally. I pulled him into a hug. "You don't have anything to be sorry for." That night I realized something important. I wasn't choosing between my husband and my son. Thomas had already made that choice when he decided my love had to be proven by sacrifice. And I wasn't willing to sacrifice my child. The divorce didn't end with fireworks. There were no dramatic courtroom speeches, no last-minute apologies, no cinematic reconciliation where everything suddenly made sense again. It ended with paperwork. Stacks of it. Pages that reduced years of shared life into signatures and dates. meetings with lawyers who spoke in calm, neutral tones, while my stomach twisted into knots. Long pauses where Thomas and I sat across from each other, avoiding eye contact like strangers who happened to know each other's worst habits. When it was finally done, when the last document was signed and the door to the conference room closed behind me, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not happiness, not triumph. Relief. Driving home that day, I realized how long I'd been living with tension humming in the background, like a low electrical buzz you don't notice until it finally switches off. The house was quiet when I walked in. No slammed doors, no accusations hanging in the air, just stillness. Caleb was at school. I sat at the kitchen table alone and let myself breathe. The weeks that followed were strange but steady. Thomas got his share. I got mine. Everything was divided cleanly, legally, and with far less drama than I'd braced myself for. Ryan chose to stay with his father. I wished him well, genuinely, but I didn't chase. I was done trying to earn my place through sacrifice. Caleb and I settled into a new rhythm. We talked more about school, about work, about things that had nothing to do with money or conflict. I could see the weight lifting from him slowly, his shoulders relaxing now that he wasn't walking on eggshells in his own home. He bought his car, a reliable used sedan, nothing flashy, and saved the rest of his money just like he said he would. Watching him make those choices felt like quiet vindication. One night, while we were cleaning up after dinner, he smiled at me and said, "I'm glad it's just us now." I didn't answer right away, I just nodded, because I felt it too. Life didn't suddenly become perfect. There were lonely evenings, moments where I caught myself reaching for my phone out of habit, only to remember there was no one to call. But the peace outweighed the loss. Months later, when I wasn't looking for anything, when I'd stopped thinking of myself as someone who needed to fix or replace what was gone, I met Daniel. A friend introduced us over coffee. No pressure, no expectations, just conversation that flowed easily, like we'd known each other longer than we had. He listened more than he spoke. He didn't rush, and most importantly, he didn't see my boundaries as obstacles. His ex-girlfriend showed up briefly in our lives. Resentful, sharp-edged, clearly uncomfortable with the fact that Daniel had moved on. But this time, I didn't spiral. I didn't compete. Daniel handled it calmly, firmly, and without dragging me into unnecessary drama. That alone told me everything I needed to know. When Daniel met Caleb, I watched carefully. He didn't try to play dad, didn't force jokes or authority. He showed up as himself, respectful, curious, kind. They talked about school, movies, and plans for the future. That was it. And somehow that was enough. Looking back now, I understand something I didn't before. Fairness isn't about making everything identical. Love isn't proven through sacrifice that leaves one person diminished. And protecting your child isn't favoritism, it's responsibility. Some storms don't pass on their own. Some only end when you stop standing in the rain. And walking away wasn't failure. It was the moment I chose peace.